Right now, the shutdown showdown continues. The president coming out swinging today, making clear he is not backing down an inch. But he also left a window of compromise open. The question is, will Boehner step through it? Tonight, Congressman Tim Bishop, he will bring us inside the Beltway here on what's going on behind the scenes on how negotiations are or are not going on Capitol Hill. And later, bikers and cops, more news in the road rage incident that has captured the nation's attention. Now we learn off-duty cops here were actually part of the band of bikers. A legal expert joins to explain how this all plays out in the courtroom. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French, and thank you so much for joining us this Tuesday evening, October 8th. Well, in short here, not a lot of news to report on the showdown front, except yet another day ticks off the calendar till we get to what some call financial Armageddon. Let me bring in our senior political correspondent, Andrew Whitman, to join us with the very latest. And while we say same old, the consequences keep getting ratcheted up, and not only the financial markets, but the public, they're starting to feel and also worry about the potential pain.
And today, Rich, we saw the big players from both sides front and center, including President Obama. He spoke today and called on Congress once again to end the shutdown and raise the debt limit. It's day 8 of the government shutdown, and today President Obama floated a possible solution.
Let's just at least make sure that we keep the lights on while we're having these conversations.
The president indicated he would support a short-term bill that funds the government and raises the debt ceiling, but for just long enough to hold broader talks on the deficit and health care. But the president does have his limits.
I won't let them gut a law that is going to make sure tens of millions of people actually get health care, but I'm happy to talk about it.
It marked a shift in tone from the president, who said for weeks he wouldn't negotiate when it came to the full faith and credit of the U.S. government.
We're not going to pay a ransom for America paying its bills.
On October 17th, the federal government will reach its borrowing limit and begin defaulting on its debts unless Congress raises the debt ceiling. House Speaker John Boehner said he wants to negotiate with the president.
At times like this, the American people expect their leaders to sit down and have a conversation. I want that conversation to occur now.
The president said sure, but not until the government reopens and the threat of default is lifted.
The entire basis of the Republican strategy is we're going to shut down the government or cause economic chaos if we don't get 100% of what we want.
But Speaker Boehner said that what President Obama is asking Republicans to do amounts to unconditional surrender. Everyone in Washington seemed to up the urgency today, but the government no closer to reopening, and we're no closer to a debt limit, a debt ceiling resolution. Rich?
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. And for more, we're very pleased to be joined by Congressman Tim Bishop, Democrat from Long Island. Congressman, it's good to see you, but I get the sense that since we last spoke, there's no reason for further optimism right now. Unless I missed a news flash, is that a fair representation of where we are?
I think it is. I think there was a little hope towards the latter part of last week when Speaker Boehner was, privately letting people know that he was not going to let the country go into default. But at least publicly, he has now backed away from that. He is demanding concessions with respect to increasing the debt limit, and he's making it clear that he will not bring to the floor a so-called clean extension of the debt limit bill, and the president is making clear, as well he should, that he's not going to negotiate on the debt limit. So we seem to be at impasse. When you're at an impasse and you're trying to negotiate something, you give and you get a little bit. Are you clear right now, if you want to work across the aisle, who you're talking to, who in fact is in charge right now, and moreover, what they really want? What is the strategy from the other side of the aisle for this end game? It's not entirely clear. Number one, one would think that that the president would be dealing with Speaker Boehner. Unfortunately, there have been 2 instances just in the last couple of weeks in which Speaker Boehner was not able to deliver on promises that he had made. You would like to think that you're dealing with the Speaker, but he's got a group of people, the extreme right fringe of the far right, that really is extremely difficult in terms of moving arriving at a set of policies to move the country forward. What the president is proposing, and he's absolutely right, give us the capacity to reopen the government, give us the capacity to pay our bills, and then we'll sit down and we'll put everything on the table and we'll try to hash out our differences. That's the way this should go forward. But job one is to reopen the government, and job 1A is to see to it that come October 17th we can pay our bills. Those are two very reasonable things for the president to want to be able to do.
Well, let me talk about job 1A, because nobody thought that anyone in their right mind would actually go up again like we did a couple of years ago to the edge of the debt limit, let alone go over it. But I'm hearing what some of your colleagues are saying, and unless they're bluffing, they really believe that there's not a real downside if we go over the debt limit cliff. Can you just articulate for folks? I mean, I've been trying to. This is not hyperbole. Everybody I've spoken to in the financial sector, every economist, now we're getting folks from the IMF on the global level. Everybody says you're talking about Armageddon. If you're talking about problems with recovery, this turns it into recession or worse with even longer term consequences. Just how scary is the fire these folks are playing with when it comes to the debt limit?
I think it's very scary, and frankly, it is alarming in the extreme to hear some of my colleagues say that not only will failure to pay our bills and going into default not be a bad thing. They think it'll be a good thing. They think it will show the world that we're serious about our finances. Now, that is either spectacularly misinformed or it's spectacularly delusional, or both. If we do not increase the debt limit and go into default and the United States of America is unable to pay its bills, the impact both domestically and globally will be catastrophic. Interest rates will rise precipitously almost overnight. So people with adjustable rate mortgages, car loans, student loans, those rates will go through the roof. If people are paying more for interest, that means that they have less money to spend on the everyday necessities of life and on the luxuries of life. So our country will very quickly find itself in a recession. I think anyone who thinks that we can go into default and that we can get up the next morning and the world's going to be exactly as it is before we went into default, as I say, they're either terribly misinformed or they're simply delusional.
I can also imagine the phone calls to your office. God forbid we get into late October here and we're still talking about this subject. People's Social Security checks aren't coming in. People's Medicare payments aren't coming in. Veterans benefits aren't happening. These are real things.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first really big benchmark, I think the stock market will react immediately. I think the credit markets will react immediately. But the first really big benchmark where people are going to see it in their everyday lives, October 23rd, there's a big Social Security payment due. And if we can't make that payment, I think that is going to have an enormous impact. I mean, it's going to inflict an enormous amount of pain on people who have come to rely on their Social Security checks, quite understandably. I mean, these are people that paid into Social Security their entire working lives, and now all of a sudden we're going to say we can't make payroll this month? I mean, that's simply unacceptable. Doctors are not going to get paid for the Medicare services they provide. Hospitals are not going to get paid. So if people are not getting paid, that means they're not going to be able to spend money. So again, another reason for why the economy will grind to a halt. 70% of our economy is rooted in consumer spending. If you're not paying doctors, if you're not paying hospitals, if you're not paying Social Security checks, if you're not making good on veterans benefits, consumer spending is going to grind to a halt, not to mention the hundreds of thousands of federal employees that would be laid off. So this is a really, really serious set of consequences.
Finally, Congressman, I'm sure you've seen the polls. While people blame Republicans in Congress most of all, the president and Democrats on the Hill, they've also taken a hit for this. We're going to be joined by an old colleague of yours, Chris Shays, here shortly. One of the more moderate voices on the Republican side is no longer in D.C. Why don't you just tell not just him but our audience how the climate in Washington since you've been there, how it's really changed considerably in the last 4-6 years with some of the new folks who've come to Washington with kind of a crash and burn mentality.
I came to Washington in 2003, and there were certainly partisan differences then, and there were very sort of firmly entrenched positions. I mean, we have different views of the role of government. That's legitimate. That's life in a democracy. It's to be expected. But I think with the class that entered the Congress in 2010, the class that was heavily influenced by the Tea Party, I think that has changed the tenor in Washington, and it's changed the conversation in Washington very much to the detriment, I believe, of the country. I believe the kind of sort of take no prisoners approach that so many of my colleagues are now taking is really creating an environment that's quite toxic and makes it extremely difficult to find common ground, because you have people who really won't even recognize the implications of that which they say they support. And so when you have people who are espousing positions, the consequences of which they either are unaware of or contemptuous of, it makes it extremely difficult to move forward in a way that reasonable people can support.
Do you believe before the clock strikes midnight that cooler heads will prevail and sanity will take hold before the 17th, or are we actually going to go over this edge?
I believe that cooler heads will prevail and sanity will take hold. I believe that in a push comes to shove environment, that Speaker Boehner will recognize that he and the extreme right fringe of the far right are the only thing that's standing between this country going over the brink in terms of going into default and being able to go forward in a way that's prudent.
I sure hope you're right. Congressman, I appreciate it as always. A few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, we want to bring you into our conversation, and here's our question. Who will you point the finger of blame when it comes to the government shutdown? Now, when we come back, we're going to bring in our power panel to face off on just that issue, and if there is an end game, what this thing will look like. Stay with us, everybody. RFL back right after this.